See, I've been racking my brain for the last few years trying to ascertain exactly how our governments and the corporations sponsoring them were going to reframe gang stalking. The way in which they plan to do it is to legalize gang stalking. Now, I've already talked about this before with the onset of 2020's fun time that we had. I talked about it then, where people were basically encouraged to snitch on each other if they weren't following the guidelines, okay? But it's more than just people snitching on one another and people spying on one another. There are all kinds of different factors that enter the equation, and there are some things that I didn't even think of with regards to how gang stalking could be legalized that should really worry and alarm everyone, okay? Now, how, knowing that gang stalking is being exposed, knowing that the exposure of high profile people will most likely lead to the truth about gang stalking. It's already started. We've already got people investigating. Well, we've already got people filing lawsuits against the Carters for gang stalking, right? Now that gang stalking is threatening to pop its head up and become part of mainstream conversation, how will the governments and corporations reframe this? I was getting close with technology. I was getting close with the 2020 shenanigans that went on and the regulations around that. I was close, but no cigar. There are a few things here that never occurred to me before that I really should have been looking at. The first thing is the elderly and the infirm being increasingly euthanized in medical hospitals. And I know I'm not supposed to say this. I'm going out on a limb saying this, and saying this is very, very likely to get me reported, but it has to be said. Legally euthanizing the elderly or the infirm by refusing to drain the fluid from their lungs as they are dying. It's actually a very simple procedure, but depending on whether the medical staff think it's a good idea to cut them off, or whether they cajole family members into cutting somebody's life away, there is a legal guideline put in place, I won't say by who, that if the elderly or infirm find themselves in hospital and they find themselves at a critical stage where their lungs are filling up with fluid, that medical staff are not permitted to drain the fluid out of the elderly or very sick person. But before they get to that stage, their body has to be weakened. And in order for their body to be weakened, they have to be underfed. Not unfed altogether, underfed. It's important that the sick person is underfed so that their body is sufficiently weakened. Then, if they enter comas or they enter like really serious physical situations, their lungs filling up with fluid, instead of actually draining the fluid, they let the infirm person or the elderly person choke on the fluid in their lungs. So what we're getting into now is legally euthanizing the elderly or infirm. That's one part of legalized trafficking. Okay? Doing that, it doesn't necessarily make money, but it does alleviate some of the liabilities that are created in general society with an aging population, because this population has been aging, to my knowledge. So the best way to deal with that is to legally euthanize the elderly. And if you can euthanize people who are sick, who can be treated, but it would take they would take a lot of money to treat, instead of treating them, you leave them to die. So that's the first part of legalized trafficking to get into. It's very controversial what I've just said, but it's basically an open secret among everyone. Everybody is afraid to say it. But that is actually what's going on in the world. Like, the elderly and the long-term ill are being legally euthanized by weakening their bodies and refusing to drain the fluid from their lungs when they have fluid in their lungs. So that's the first part of the legalized trafficking that stops the exposure of gang stalking in its tracks and stops gang stalkers from actually facing justice. That's the first part. The second part, and I know this is going to rub a lot of targeted individuals the wrong way, but this pro-life shit, pro-life anti-abortion stuff, is also a part of legalized trafficking. Why? Because in the US, the adoption industry in 2015 was worth approximately 14 billion. Over here in the UK, it cost £37,059 to place a child through adoption, through voluntary adoption. So adoption is big business. If you removed abortion from the equation and you forced women to actually have the, like, let's just say, for argument's sake, instead of having the child, or, you know, letting the fetus go to full term and then having them as a child, let's just say, for argument's sake, they wanted to adopt. Somebody is about to attain a lot of money for all the unwanted kids that they get through lack of safe abortion options. So that's one part of legalized trafficking, the adoption industry. And that's something that I didn't even think of. And we've seen it through TIs who have had their children taken away from them, custody wrangled away from them for no reason at all, other than the fact that they were put on a list. Because there are quite a few TIs, if you look at their cases carefully, they're not unfit parents. It's just that their children were taken away from them through being continually harassed by social services or the psychiatric profession. That's another form of legalized trafficking that you guys have to consider. That's one part of it. The second part of it is that if the mother decides through her being forced to actually give birth to this baby, have this baby and look after it, we're talking at the very least, the military industrial complex, that's more people for the army, the prison industrial complex, that's more people for prison labor, and the psychiatric industrial complex, which is more people to be free guinea pigs for untested psychiatric drugs. So that's another form of legalized trafficking. And we can, you know, as for those three complexes, we can include the homeless in that too. Because a lot of vulnerable people find themselves in the psychiatric profession, you know, through being subject to experimentation, not only into drugs, but also into AI as well. Check out that surprise witness. The amount of shit that you will see is crazy over there. Check out that surprise witness and check out her exposure of soft white underbelly to get a proper understanding of what I'm talking about. So we've got the psychiatric industrial complex with the homeless. We've also got the prison industrial complex with the homeless, because remember, they charge you for being homeless in this country. They fine you for it. And if you can't pay the money, you end up in prison or jail. It's jail, not prison. And then you've got the military industrial complex. I don't know how many homeless people end up being enlisted in the army, but I do know that quite a few of the homeless population are vets. So you've got the homeless wrapped up in the military, prison, and psychiatric industrial complexes. That's a fourth kind of legalized trafficking. The fifth kind is psychiatric trafficking. That's the most popular among people who want to put people on watch lists for the rest of their lives and watch as their lives completely deteriorate. Okay, so psychiatric trafficking is facilitated by harassing people to the point of losing their mental health, or, you know, destabilizing them emotionally so that people can make out they're actually crazy. And part of a big part of the abuse that causes somebody to lose their emotional regulation is making the abuse as elaborate as possible, so that when somebody explains the abuse to someone else, not only are they emotionally dysregulated by this point, they also look crazy trying to explain the abuse, because the abuse is so intricate and is so detailed in every single facet of the person's life. If they were to explain it to the police, or explain it to mental health, or explain it to, they would look crazy. That's a major part of the psychiatric trafficking. Then there is the immense physical torture via remote means, electronic weaponry, DEWs, EMFs, long-range acoustic devices, all that shit. Immense physical torture through electronic means. That's mostly DEWs and electromagnetic frequency weapons. The long-range acoustic devices are very good at throwing voices to your skeleton, so that it can appear as though you're having auditory hallucinations. And again, making the abuse detailed on this level, it makes you look crazy to the people that you're talking to. So it facilitates the psychiatric trafficking. Financial abuse also plays a major part in that, because if you're financially abused, it casts doubt, like from a legal perspective, it casts doubt into your ability to actually take care of yourself, and then you become reliant on the state. You're completely helpless, and you're completely without means, right? And this doesn't just include finding subtle ways to prevent access or remove access to your own money. It can also include sectioning, affecting your ability to pass on whatever you have to someone else. Psychiatric trafficking is not just about moving the body and subjecting the body to unlawful experimentation or slow genocide. It's not just that. It's also the annexing of resources through the back door. Yeah? It's also the annexing of resources through the back door. When you need to know the reason why anybody does anything, follow the money. And then we've got the displacement of the poor or immigrants. We've talked about environmental racism. That's more of a conversation that the US has, but trust me, environmental racism happens down here too. You've heard Rishi Sunak talk about taking money out of poorer communities and funneling them back into communities that are already rich. You've heard him talk about that. So of course, the poor or immigrants are going to be moved to rundown communities where they're forced to go at each other's throats. And in the meantime, while that's happening, there's the military industrial complex playing out through gangstalking and through law enforcement enlisting informal collaborators. There's the prison industrial complex happening by making sure that poorer people are more likely to go into prison. There's the psychiatric industrial complex, and that's the biggest one of all. That's usually the most successful one, ensuring that poorer people or vulnerable people from a poorer background end up in the system, so that they can always be tracked and they can always have an eye kept on them. So displacement of poor or immigrants, it doesn't just involve the industrial complexes. We also have to talk about real estate as well, moving them from place to place and ensuring wherever you move the poor, you remove them to a prime spot for psychiatric or widespread experimentation. This is a little known secret among everybody. Like, a lot of poorer communities are also perfect breeding grounds for social experimentation. So the displacement of the poor and or immigrants, that's also another form of legalized trafficking. Trying to move immigrants to fucking Rwanda or trying to remove them from this country to another country, legalized trafficking. That's human trafficking. Right? And then another thing we have to consider is that with the banning of porn, as much as a lot of people don't like porn, and I to be honest, I understand why, given the practices of porn and given how people are treated in the porn industry, once porn gets banned, it will go underground. And if you think things were bad when porn was mainstream, you have no idea how bad that shit is about to get. When the black market, when more things become legalized, the black market becomes more lucrative. So not only have we got legalized trafficking on the surface with, you know, in some cases, child labor laws going backwards, and we've got all of these other things that I've mentioned, on top of the legalized trafficking on the surface, we've got illegal trafficking underneath that, getting bigger and getting stronger and becoming more lucrative. So when you put all this together, all of this is about money. Every single thing that TIs have gone through is experimentation into playing around with legislations, with rules, with regulations, with ways to make extra money that they then unleash onto the public when they feel it's more successful, when they feel it's successful to do so. So that is something that a lot of gang stalking victims, a lot of gang stalking survivors, TIs, this is what we need to consider. The way they are going to reframe Havana syndrome is not just through making out that BRICS is to blame for it, because BRICS are attacking the people in their own countries as well. We know this for a fact. BRICS are also attacking people in their own countries. There is no good guy in this scenario. But on top of people in Western countries either blaming gang stalking on BRICS or blaming it squarely on the West, like either or, it's not just that, it's also all these things that I've mentioned, the undercover legal euthanizations, the pro-life argument, the psychiatric trafficking, the displacement of poor and immigrant people, the black market becoming more lucrative. All of this comes into it. And as for women's rights being rolled backwards, if women lose their autonomy, then instead of needing prostitution, we just become wholesale prostitutes for the state. We don't even have the right to decide whether or not we want to abort fetuses before they become full term. We won't even have that right anymore. We'll just be broodmares for the state. If any, and rights are already being rolled back in the UK. It's not just the US. It's just the UK are doing it more quietly. The more autonomy you remove from a woman is the more she becomes a broodmare for the state. Legalized trafficking again. Legalized trafficking again. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, if you want to know how our authorities, how our governments all over the world, and how our corporations all over the world plan to get themselves out of gang stalking, they're going to get themselves out of gang stalking by making legalized trafficking more obvious and more aggressive. That's how they're going to do it. That's how they're going to do it. And now that I think about it, I'm like, wow. Ugh. Now I think about my mum and my granddad, and I'm sorry about the way that they left this earth, but the world that they would have been coming into, oof. Doesn't even bear thinking about. It really doesn't. It really doesn't. Shit is wild out here. And it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. All this P. Diddy stuff, it should be leading towards us getting justice. But again, when people like, I'm supposed to celebrate because I'm seeing legitimate scumbags. I'm seeing some of the worst people on the planet finally get their just desserts. Finally. But the one time where it's supposed to happen, it's not going to be of any benefit to the victims. It's not going to be of any benefit to any of the communities that they've hurt. No, it's going to be to the benefit of the people who put them there to be handlers in the first place. That's who it's going to benefit. And the West, let's be absolutely clear. The West and Israel are losing power. They're not gaining it. And when you lose power, when you stand to lose power, you become more aggressive. And unfortunately, lives are being cost because of it. On both sides. The Palestinians more than Israelis, but both sides. So yes, that is how gangstalking is going to be. It is going to be reframed. It's going to be reframed through legitimized and legalized trafficking, which ironically will only make illegal trafficking even worse and even more profitable. Watch this space. If you're a TI and you've made it this far, let me know how you guys are doing. I want to hear from you. Don't be surprised if this video ends up being reported. I highly suggest you download this motherfucker before anybody takes it. Peace and blessings. Bye-bye.